The world's two largest economies stand on the brink of a trade war, with China this afternoon threatening to place tariffs on $3 billion of US imports. Some kind of response was inevitable, of course, after US President Donald Trump announced he wants to impose tariffs on up to $60 billion US dollars worth of imports from China.
But we have one particular problem, and I view them as a friend. I have tremendous respect for President Xi. We have a great relationship. They're helping us a lot in North Korea, and that's China. But we have a trade deficit, depending on the way you calculate, of $504 billion. Now, some people would say it's really $375 billion. Many different ways of looking at it, but any way you look at it, it is the largest deficit of any country in the history of our world. It's out of control. We have a tremendous intellectual property theft situation going on, which likewise is hundreds of billions of dollars, and that's on a yearly basis.
Donald Trump, well, the language was reasonably incendiary. Share markets in Asia and the US fell heavily on that language and the news of China's response, even though China's response was considered by many to be relatively moderate so far. And given New Zealand's reliance on trade, the government here says it's taking any notion of a tit-for-tat trade war very seriously. Of course, here's our Deputy Political Editor, Chris Bramwell.
Donald Trump says China is stealing the US's technology and intellectual property, prompting him to unveil his plans for massive tariffs on Chinese products. China, in turn, this afternoon unveiled plans to levy duties on up to $3 billion worth of US imports in response to the steel and aluminium tariffs which come into effect today. China has assembled a list of 128 US products that could be targeted if the two countries can't reach an agreement on trade issues. New Zealand's Trade Minister David Parker says the sudden escalation in trade threats is alarming.
We are taking it very seriously. I think these sorts of situations highlight the importance of having clear and agreed rules for trade. We think that's in New Zealand's interest. We don't have, a lot of economic muscle born of size, so we're reliant on rules-based institutions.
Mr Parker says China and the US need to show restraint as a tit-for-tat escalation doesn't benefit anyone.
I think we need to be a bit careful not to overreact. There's lots of threats being made, but it's not yet clear what is going to eventuate. We don't know enough really to take a final position. When we do take a position, it will be based on our independent foreign policy.
Greg Autry co-authored a book called Death by China with Peter Navarro, who is now Donald Trump's Director of Trade Policy. Mr Autry says Donald Trump's negotiating style is to make a bold and forceful opening move and then see whether accommodations can be reached. The Dow Jones Index fell 3% after Mr Trump's announcement, but Greg Autry told CNN the president spent a year talking to the Chinese to no avail and now he's taking action.
If we allow those intellectual properties developed by American taxpayers and American companies to simply be stolen because we're afraid of the Dow dropping 2% or 3% in a day, we are going to be the world's patsies. And the Chinese government understands that. These are Chinese state-owned organizations that target these American companies when they steal these products and put them out of business. It is an integrated policy in Beijing, and it should have been dealt with years ago.
The Executive Director of the New Zealand-China Council, Stephen Jacoby, says everybody would agree that there are issues with the protection of intellectual property in China, but whether that is as bad as the US is alleging is a matter for debate.
The problem is that the United States is trying to address this problem by putting tariffs on other products that have nothing to do with intellectual property. So they'll be taxing, presumably, China's exports of clothing and apparel and manufactured products to the United States. That is not only going to affect those industries in the United States, it's going to cause massive damage to international trade.
Mr Jacoby says New Zealand could actually stand to benefit if China does slap tariffs on US agricultural products.
Well, it's no secret that New Zealand is an agriculture exporter to China, so the extent that the Chinese seek to block or to raise tariffs on US products possibly opens up opportunity for New Zealand. But there's a bigger picture here, and that is nobody benefits from this sort of action in the longer term. It disrupts markets, it takes out confidence, and New Zealand could well be damaged by those sorts of things, even if we might benefit, depending on what action is taken.
The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, says New Zealand is closely watching what happens offshore and will maintain its line that open global trade is a good thing.
We continue to be a country that benefits hugely from multilateral trade agreements that always has argued against situations where we might have tariff wars, and so for us it's all about maintaining that position.
New Zealand has sought an exemption to the US administration's steel and aluminium tariffs due to come into effect today. The US trade chief has listed a number of countries that will be exempt, including Canada, Mexico and Australia. But Jacinda Ardern isn't worried about that just yet, saying the government will wait for a formal response from the United States. Atu i te wharepari mata mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Chris Bramwell ahau.